I believe Mike Wimsatt is here.
Let's get Mike on first, please.
Yep. Okay, Mike, you should be able to unmute.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Mike.
Yes, for the record, my name is Mike Wimsatt. I serve as Director of the Waste Management Division for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. The department is not taking a position on this bill. We have, as requested, provided a letter that provides some background information about how the agency processes application for permits. And the content of that letter and the issues that we cover in the letter are really based on the concerns that were raised during the House Environment and Agriculture Committee's hearing. So that letter has been placed into, I would like to have it placed in the testimony as a reference item for the committee members. And I don't have any testimony to provide, but would be happy to field any questions.
Okay, questions from the committee? Senator Waters, then Senator Gray.
Go ahead, Senator Gray.
Senator Gray.
I was just going to ask that he summarize the content of the letter a little more so that the people that are zooming in would have better access to that information. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Senator. I'd be happy to do that. So when we listened to the hearing at the House Environment and Agriculture Committee, we heard a lot of concerns regarding some of the same concerns you've heard today regarding particular, and this is not to diminish them, but the conditions that are termed nuisance conditions. So that would be things like odor, litter, vectors like birds or vermin, noise, and impacts on offsite properties. So what we provide in the letter is a summary of the requirements of the rules and the conditions that we typically put in solid waste landfill permits to address those particular nuisance conditions. And those provisions are many. They include requirements to apply daily and intermediate cover over waste, so that waste that is deposited in the landfill during its operation is not left uncovered for an extended period of time. And that helps to address issues of odor and vectors. Also, limiting exposed waste during filling operations to the smallest area practicable. So that means basically what's termed the working face of the landfill. As you are operating a landfill and accepting shipments of waste, there's an expectation that you will operate the area where waste is actively being disposed each day as a minimum area. So you have the minimum amount of waste exposed at any given time. We expect that litter fences and also just policing the surrounding areas for wind-blown litter is a way to manage litter from being blown off of the site. Installing and operating a landfill gas collection and control system. This is really the primary and most important means of controlling odors from landfills, because the odors from landfills certainly include waste that's actively being tipped in and disposed of on a given day, particularly if that's particularly odorous. But the odor impacts tend to be from landfill gas. So as the waste has been deposited and begins to decompose, it generates a variety of landfill gases, some of which have a very high amount of odor. And so what we require is that an engineered gas collection and control system be designed and installed both during operation and then after closure of the landfill, so that basically there are pipes and headers that collect landfill gas under vacuum, and then that gas can be conveyed to a flare to burn it off so that the odors aren't detected, or in some cases, in many cases, sent to an engine where it's burned for its energy recovery to generate power to sell back to the electric grid. And that's a common thing at some of our larger landfills. Also conducting periodic landfill cover integrity checks and surface emission monitoring. So we do require that the cover on a landfill, both in the immediate working area, but also across the entire landfill, be checked to make sure that it is adequate, that it hasn't eroded away. And then we also have required the operators of the landfill, and this is also done as a compliance monitoring technique by staff in our Air Resources Division, where they take detecting devices that can detect landfill gas, and they do surface emission monitoring over the surface of the landfill. And those are requirements that are both in the rules and in the permit, in provisions in the permits that we issue. Also rejecting odorous waste. So, in some cases, there may just be waste that creates such odor problems that we expect, if that happens continuously, we would expect the landfill operator to reject those wastes. That's a means of managing odors. Or requiring that those wastes be treated prior to arrival at the facility. And a recent example is that in a recent permit, we require that any wastewater treatment sludges that come to the facility be treated before being shipped to the facility to reduce odors and to neutralize the odors that they produce. Also, it's common to the rules limit the operations of the facility between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. so that you don't have operations happening that would create noise or generate odors in the overnight hours. Also, with respect to noise, we've had provisions in some of our permits to require the use of what's called a static alarm on equipment. So if you everybody's heard a piece of heavy equipment backing up and that loud beeping alarm that you can hear a long distance away. So in some cases where that has posed a problem for neighbors, we have requested that static alarms on equipment, at least that equipment that is operated routinely at the facilities, such as compactors and other facility-owned trucks, to be equipped with the static alarm, which still provides the level of safety, but the sound doesn't travel nearly as far. And then also for birds, in some cases required to implement a bird depredation program where they would actually control the birds that maybe, if a facility is having trouble with a high number, implement a variety of techniques to get rid of the birds. So the second thing so that's kind of a rundown of the list that we provided in the letter of the provisions for addressing those nuisance conditions. There was also, as you've heard this morning or this afternoon, and also in the E&A committee, witnesses expressing concerns about the potential for contamination of groundwater and surface water from landfill operations and management of leachate. And we do have a paragraph in the letter which describes that any proposed landfill must undergo very rigorous hydrologic and hydrogeological evaluations to ensure that the proposed facility meets our siting criteria with respect to groundwater and surface water, and also to ensure that the conditions are well understood and that the fate and transport of any potential contamination could be predicted. The rules require that landfills be designed and constructed in New Hampshire with a double synthetic liner system. So the primary liner is designed to collect any leachate, that's the liquid that percolates down through the landfill waste from precipitation and any moisture that's in the waste that's received. And so it's a normal part of any landfill operation. There will be leachate generated. And the primary liner is designed to have leachate collected on the liner and then have a leachate collection system that's designed to get that leachate off the liner as promptly as possible. Two engineered leachate collection systems through pipes and tanks, and then those tanks are periodically pumped off, and the leachate is generally shipped to a wastewater treatment facility for treatment. And then the purpose of the secondary liner is to capture it in the event of any releases from the cap or the primary liner. That secondary liner is designed to capture any of those releases, and then that leachate is similarly collected for offsite disposal and treatment. If a release is detected, under normal conditions, a landfill is required to do groundwater monitoring, and they're required to have a groundwater release detection permit, which requires the permittee to monitor groundwater quality on a periodic basis. And then if a release is detected, that's the purpose of that monitoring, then appropriate actions are required to identify and remedy the source of the release, and then basically monitoring is stepped up, and if there's a determination that there is a release, then remedial actions are required. And all of that is designed to protect groundwater and surface waters near the landfill. the public benefit requirement. So RSA 149M, the statute, the Solid Waste Act in New Hampshire, requires that any time DES reviews a permit application for a solid waste facility, particularly a landfill, it must determine, in order to approve that application, that the proposed solid waste facility provides a substantial public benefit. And that public benefit is defined in the statute as basically meeting three criteria. And in order to find that there is a public benefit, that the facility provides a public benefit, the agency must find that all three of those criteria are satisfied. And in short, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, the first one is the short and long-term, that we have to consider these criteria. The first one is the short and long-term need for a facility of the proposed type, size, and location to provide capacity to accommodate solid waste generated within the state. The second one is the ability of the proposed facility to assist the state in achieving the implementation of the hierarchy and goals, and that the hierarchies provided for in this is identified in the statute, and goals both in the statute but also in any solid waste plans that the agency may prepare or that are submitted by districts to the agency. And then the third one is the ability of the proposed facility to assist in achieving the goals of the state solid waste management plan and one or more solid waste plans. And I apologize, I kind of covered that in the earlier one. But basically, so those are the three criteria that an applicant for a new landfill or an expansion of landfill needs to make a showing in their application that they meet those three criteria. And the agency must review that and make that determination and concur that the facility meets those criteria in order to show that the facility would provide a substantial public benefit. So that's part of the criteria for reviewing an application. And that's a maybe not so brief summary of our letter.
Senator Gray.
Yes, an additional question. Certainly, because I represent Rochester and actually live in Rochester, and the Turnkey Landfill is here, I asked for the quarterly report for the first quarter of this year and found that there was only one complaint on there that had to do with noise of construction. They made a new road down there. Is that unusual for a modern landfill that's following the compliance for your agency?
In the last quarter for the turnkey facility, I would say that would be unusual. I would say typically we receive more noise and odor complaints than that in a quarter. And well, I should say, not all of those would be received by the agency. In many cases, what our permits require is that in the first instance, the facility have a means and educate nearby residents and citizens how to file a complaint directly with them. Because in our experience, the best way to address noise and odor complaints is for the operators of the facility to learn about the complaint in real time so that they can actually do something about it. So it's actually more efficient and effective for folks who file complaints to contact the facility directly in real time than it is to file a complaint with DES.
Just to clear up the testimony, I actually went to the city who gets the report right from Waste Management on a quarterly basis. So there was just that one. Thank you for your testimony.
Other questions? Senator Waters.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike, for clarifying a lot of issues. And obviously, we're all very concerned about groundwater and lots of problems that we understand are out there. And 2 miles away, that DES is going to be reviewing any application pretty closely about potential effects on wetlands, groundwater, and so forth. Isn't that the kind of permitting process that requires you to do that?
But that is correct. Typically, any new facility or an expansion of facility To the extent that wetlands are impacted, it is required to get a wetlands permit in order to also be eligible for a solid waste permit. And then of course a solid waste permit is required as well. And as part of that, we would review the applicable rules related to setbacks from water features and ensuring that the siting criteria are met with respect to groundwater and surface cost protection.
You know, we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years on the planning, and we've got House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 146 kind of being grafted onto that now to try to get at the study committee and then the 10-year plan for solid waste management. And you know, we really have to find a way to source reduction, all kinds of other things that are in those bills. And you know, without getting into the lawsuits or anything, I'm just not. I would imagine that you can't refuse to consider a proposal that comes before you at this point during the process of developing that 10-year plan. Would that be correct?
So if I understand your question correctly, you know, the agency has a very clearly defined role, and that is that we are the permitting authority for solid waste facilities. And in fact, the statute directly says that DES shall administer the solid waste management program through a permit system. So anybody is eligible to apply for a permit for a facility, and our job is really very clinical. We look at that and we review it against all of the criteria in the law and in the rules, and we make a determination about whether that facility application can meet all of those requirements.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I'd like to. I noticed that Representative Bixby brought up banning organic and construction debris, and it just draws my attention to potential of recycling. Are we recycling in the state at all?
Oh, sure. So recycling has been going on for decades in New Hampshire as well as across the country. I think a lot of people have the impression, and it is, depending on how they interpret it, it's partly true, that recycling has been in decline in recent years. And there's a very specific reason for that. And I think at some level, it's because we got very global for a while, to a point where a significant percentage of the whole country's recyclables were being shipped to China and some other countries as well, but primarily China. China was going through a massive growth period where they were desperate for raw materials, and they were willing to take recyclables because they were mining those recyclables for raw materials. But after doing that for many years, they sort of determined that they were becoming the delivery place for the world's garbage. And what was happening was that a lot of single stream recycling, where most of us are familiar with that, we put paper and cans and metal and plastic all in the same bin, and it's carried away as a single stream recycling. What they were finding is that even after the country's materials recovery facilities, what we call MRFs for short. This is a place where you bring those single stream and they get separated out into the various component parts. Even after that process was done, the levels of what they would call contamination, which just means if I've got a bale of what's supposed to be HDPE #1 plastic, anything in it that's not HDPE #1 plastic is considered contamination to a recycler. So what they were finding is what they were getting had higher levels of contamination, such that it didn't make it that valuable to them. So they basically initially implemented something called a green fence, where they said, well, we're gonna look at this a little more closely, and we're gonna set higher standards, but we'll still take material. And then they put up what they called the national sword, which is a strange name, but basically they're just saying, unless you meet this particular contamination percentage and it's low enough, we will not take your material. And so what happened was the whole nation's recyclables that we were typically sending to China didn't meet that standard. So suddenly it was like a door got slammed. And we had all these materials that had, normally had an outlet for years, that no longer had an outlet. And as a result of being able to do that for so many years, the capacity to manage recyclables and reuse recyclables in the United States was diminished. So I like to describe it, and people who are a lot smarter than me on this describe it as a national reset, where the country is going through a reset, reevaluating how it collects and processes recyclables, and that's going to take some time. And unfortunately, we're still suffering from it. But during its peak, we're rebounding a little bit. But during its peak, commodities prices for these recyclables dropped precipitously, and yet so the requirement to try to operate these MRFs as effectively as possible to reduce contamination was very expensive. So to put it in perspective, some people would put an average tipping fee around $80 to $85, $90 a ton at a landfill for a ton of trash. The materials recovery facility, which for a while was competitive with that at least, or maybe even cheaper, during this national sword policy implementation, those MRFs were charging up to $140 a ton on contract. So a community looking at their options would say, well, I can spend $140 to recycle this, or I can send it to a landfill for $85. Which am I going to do? And of course, community leaders are faced with very difficult decisions economically. So as a result, we did see a number of communities decide to just dispose of their recyclables. Most of them had worked so long and so hard to keep recycling as part of their paradigm that they just paid the money and they continued doing it. We're going through a reset now. I think it'll get better, but we're not there yet. And so for a lot of communities that have single stream recycling, this continues to be an economic problem.
So if I may interrupt real quick, I know that Representative Bixby brought up capacity too. So that goes into the capacity situation where if we're not recycling, it's going into our landfills, and our landfills are getting full. And what is our capacity situation at this point?
So with regard to capacity, so we have three major commercial landfills currently operating in New Hampshire. There are a few municipal landfills that do some commercial operation, but they're limited service areas. So I'm not going to talk about those. The relevance to the statewide system is really these three landfills. The biggest one, Senator Gray made reference to, and that's the Turnkey Landfill in Rochester, operated by Waste Management Incorporated. That one currently has a permit that was recently, or within the last couple of years, was approved for an expansion, and that will operate through, is expected and required to operate through 2034. The second, and I would note, just this is not passing judgment on this by any means, but I think it's relevant to your question. That facility is expected to have some additional land where it could propose to expand in the future, but that's not something that is currently, that's nothing that's before the department at this time. The second one is the Mount Carberry landfill in Success, New Hampshire, which is a small town adjacent to Berlin. And that is operated by the Androscoggin Valley Regional Refuse Disposal District. And that is, although it's owned by a quasi-public, or really a public entity, it is also operated commercially. So it does take trash from an unlimited service area. It is currently permitted to operate through 2025, and I believe has an application before us, or one that may be expected that would expand it. So that also is a facility that has land that could be looked at for expansions in the future. And then the third one is the North Country Environmental Services landfill in Bethlehem. That one is currently permitted to operate through 2026. It does have land adjacent to it that theoretically could be used to expand it. However, I believe a zoning change would be required in that case in order for it to be able to expand.
So the people that are watching this hearing right now, it was news to me. Hello? The people that are watching this hearing right now, it was news to me in one of the previous hearings to find out that Massachusetts and other states actually bring in their garbage into New Hampshire. Is that true?
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
And so do we do the same? Do we send our trash down to them?
To a much lesser degree. So basically the issue that's important to understand with respect to solid waste disposal is that it's considered subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So the agency or the state can't enact something that unfairly discriminates against interstate commerce of solid waste or importation of trash to New Hampshire. So while any facility that seeks a permit in New Hampshire does have to demonstrate that it will provide a public benefit to the people of the state by providing, in part by providing capacity for the state's waste, that doesn't preclude a facility from also seeking to operate at a much greater quantity or throughput, thereby allowing out-of-state waste importation. So the Turnkey Landfill example, last year I think it was around 50-50, where about 50% of the waste landfill there was imported from out of state. I believe the NCES landfill was on the order of 25% last year. And then Mount Carberry, I'm not going to quote, it was in that range, but I remember, so I'm not going to give you the number.
So if the landfills up north run out of capacity in the next 5 or 10 years or so, what do they do with their garbage?
Well, so I guess the best way to answer that question is that if we assume as an assumption that no landfills get cited and we fill up the landfills and there's no landfills in the state, as an argument's sake, and I'm not saying we're at risk of that, but let's say that happened. What a lot of states are doing, who have taken a much more aggressive stance on development of landfills, is they are shipping their waste out of state. So there are a number of states, including New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, where very large landfills have been constructed, and there are, in southern New England or even, in the Northeast, states like New York and Connecticut are actually not only trucking trash to those out-of-state landfills, but they're actually sending it by a train.
Wow. So we could beef up our recycling in the state if we wanted to reduce our landfill intake, I would assume.
It's clear from the statute that there's a desire on the part of the legislature to maximize diversion from landfilling or any other and disposal, and maximize recycling as much as possible. That is in large part right now, market-based because of these problems we're having with the cost of processing recyclables. But certainly making recycling easier and less expensive will almost certainly have reduced the amount of waste from New Hampshire that is disposed of in our landfills.
Representative Timothy Egan mentioned that it's a $5.5 billion industry, talking about tourism. Has there been an economic impact as how it will affect tourism if this landfill, or if landfills are made? I mean, has there been a study saying that this will impact our economic benefit from our wildlife? Or do you deal with that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I'm going to try that again. Representative Egan brought up the fact that the tourism in New Hampshire is about $5.5 billion. By adding another landfill, will that or allow a couple more landfills to be built? Do you think that'll have an impact on our tourism?
I really don't know. I'm not aware of any study that's looked at that, and I really don't know the answer to that.
All right. Any more questions from the committee? Can you stick around in case we think of some more later on?
I have blocked off the whole afternoon.
We really appreciate that. Thank you very much. None. Is Mike Wimsatt available still?
Mike, if you're here, can you raise your hand? Yes, yep, Mike's here. Mike?
Mike, thank you for, just a couple of people have mentioned this, and so I figured I'd give you a shot to answer them. One of them was DES cannot protect our state parks. Rules haven't been up, they have not been updated for 20 years. Could you comment on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I apologize. In last couple of people have talked about DES not being able to protect our state parks, and that the rules have not been updated for 20 years. Is that correct?
No, the second part of that is not correct. What the caller or what the person may be referring to is our state solid waste plan has not been updated since 2003. our rules, our administrative rules, which are used to implement the statute and regulate solid waste facilities, have been modified a number of times since that time, and are constantly under a state of revision in various parts.
And the first question was, DES cannot protect our state parks.
I guess I would go back to what I said before, and that is that, you know, DES's role in permitting is to apply the rules and standards that are set out in the statute and the administrative rules. And a facility that meets those requirements, if they meet them fully, will typically get a permit. And if they don't meet those requirements, they won't get a permit. I'm not prepared to answer the question of protect state parks because, you know, I'm not sure what the definition of that is.
And apparently there is a point of DES is underfunded. Would you agree with that?
So the committee that was referenced before, that Representative Megan, now I forget her last name, but Representative Ebel stood up a committee a couple of years ago that evaluated this question in detail, and her committee, as a result of a bill that was created, took testimony from about 50 persons representing all sorts of interests in the solid waste realm. And they explored at some level, and it came up in testimony from a number of those persons, that the agency's program for solid waste management has been underfunded for a number of years due to budget cuts that occurred more than 20 years ago, particularly with respect to solid waste planning. And so that's one of the reasons why the agency is behind in updating the solid waste management plan. However, I am happy to report that the current budget, if it were to pass, does provide significant funding. And if all those positions are funded and we're allowed to hire them, we will be able to stand up a very solid program. Right now, as a result of those cuts, but also through sort of retirements that occurred and the inability to fill those positions over time, we have a fairly thin staff right now. But our expectation is in the coming biennium, we will be standing up that and reinvigorating our planning efforts.
And are you aware of any updates on the solid waste plans?
So, matter of fact, there is a bill in play right now that would reestablish that requirement and set it an update to the solid waste management plan to be due in the fall of 2022.
Do you know what bill that is?
Beg your pardon?
What bill is that?
It's Senate Bill 146. It's part of an omnibus environmental bill that Senator Waters is involved with.
Thank you. I'm doing this for the public benefit, by the way. I know that I want people to understand that this is, you know, there are things that are going on, and we want to thank Senator Waters for his hard work on this, by the way. Can you stick around in case we have some more questions? You know, when we hear testimony, I like them verified, or if they involve you, I'd like you to be able to have a say in it. That's all. So.